Okay, one, two, three. All right, my name is Les Schaffer, um, and I'm not doing as much storytelling as I used to, but still doing pretty well for somebody who's well over their mid 80s. Um, I've been doing a lot of stories the last few years, trying to rethink my life and in a sense to try to create new endings for some of these old life stories. And also I'm very anxious um, that all my stories don't die when I do. When one of us old timers dies, it's like a museum burning down or something. And so I've been doing stories that I could pass on to my children and my grandchildren and now great grandchildren. And here's one of them. I'm calling The Personal Assistant. Um, and it may or may not um, have a connection to our host today. I didn't realize that before, but maybe you'll see. So here we go. I have these old photographs. One of them from somewhere around 1904 is of Samuel Longhorn Clemens, aka Mark Twain. He's signing autographs for a group of admirers on a New York City street. One of the people huddled around him is a young man, hands in pockets, cocked jauntily on his head, and he's intently watching Twain. In another photo, taken about 5 years later, the same young man is seated on a straight back chair at the front of an old church in the sanctuary. He is sitting vigil over the body of Samuel Langhorne Clemens, excuse me, whose remains lay in a casket alongside the young man. And in yet another photo, taken about 60 years after that, an elegant white haired 80-something-year-old gentleman stands at the Joan of Arc Monument on Manhattan's Upper East Side. These grainy old photos are of Mr. Hugh Gordon Miller, a special friend, a mentor, and a hero from my own time as a very young man on my own in New York City. In the late 1950s, I worked as a clerk at a busy Manhattan Chelsea district camera store. It wasn't a bad job for a recent college flunk out. One of its advantages was I was getting to meet the era's top photographers, as well as many, many other artists and celebrities. Another attractive benefit was living on a gross salary of, I think, $44 a week. I could borrow cameras and get discounted film and processing. Every so often, an older, distinguished looking gentleman, I thought some sort of attorney, would bring in a roll or two of film for developing and printing. And remember, this was in those olden times when cameras shot pictures on rolls of acetate film that needed special chemical processing and then printing out onto pieces of paper. One day, this gentleman asked me if I was any sort of a photographer, and if so, could I shoot some pictures for him? Well, I wouldn't have exactly called myself a photographer at that point. I'd only had one or two small paying assignments, none of which called for anything much more than snapshots. Of course, I was a photographer. So the elderly man now formally introduces himself as Mr. Hugh Gordon Miller, and he spoke in what we then would call a cultured voice, very unlike mine. And it was a mixture of U.S. Southern and upper class New York. He told me that a local TV station was creating a special on Mr. Langhorne Clemens. Mark Twain to you, young man. And they wanted some pictures of Mr. Miller. Why you? Because when I was your age, young man, I served as Mr. Clemens's private secretary. And he went to spell out that the TV producers wanted shots of Miller at various sites he had visited with Mark Twain. So the following Saturday afternoon, I met him in an old building in the city's garment district. I was armed with a simple camera loaded with fast, grainy, the old Tri-X black and white film. It was an early spring day, cold, windy, overcast. Mr. Miller was bundled into a long gray overcoat, seemed to blend in with the building. He told me that back in the 1900s, this building was partially a hotel, partially a bordello, and then some garment sweatshops on the upper floors. And he pointed up to a second-story window and said that when things got too busy and noisy in the Clemens home, they would come here and rent that second-floor room for Clemens to write in. Even brought in a second writing table for Mr. Miller. Apparently, the two men were familiar with the working girls in the establishment above them, but Mr. Miller wouldn't admit to anything more. I took some pictures of him outside the building, and after he'd somehow gained entrance, I took some shots of him by that second-story window and an old writing table still in there. We spent the rest of that afternoon walking from the garment district to way downtown in Manhattan, back out to the old Hudson River docks, east through Greenwich Village, back up to Chelsea. Mr. Miller found buildings that had once held offices, private homes, theaters, salons, and saloons. Lots of saloons. Along the way, I learned that Clemens had hired Mr. Miller sight unseen, as Sam Clemens was returning from a trip around the world, the last long voyage he would take. And thanks to that overcast day, the fast film, the less than professional camera, and especially my limited photo skills, the pictures looked grainy, flat, and ancient. Mr. Miller seemed to blend into the grimy stone and brick walls. He seemed to be looking not at the camera, but into the past. He and the TV producers loved the pictures. After that outing, I didn't see him for several months. Then one summer day, he came into the store, dressed about the same as he'd been back in that cold early spring. And he was hot, and it didn't seem to be about the weather. He wanted me to grab a camera and come with him right then. And I had to explain I couldn't leave my department unattended, and we agreed to meet when my shift ended in a few hours. He said to bring a flash gun because we'd be shooting pictures indoors. Promptly, at the agreed upon time, Mr. Miller was out on 7th Avenue and led me at his usual rapid pace west to 10th Avenue. We turned south towards the west, toward western Greenwich Village, and he explained the assignment. Apparently, someone had broken into the basement of a building he owned and was storing a couple of pallets of materials there. He thought the stuff might be stolen. I asked, well, how can you be sure it's hot goods? And he said, and his voice inferred that I must be some kind of a dummy. Because, young man, the mob owns the building next door to mine. He wanted me to take pictures of the damage done by the break-in, along with shots of the suspected contraband. He intended to use these photos as evidence to bring to the police chief and the district attorney, both of whom he accused of serious foot dragging in the matter. Well, we went to his building, down into the basement. I took a bunch of photographs of what looked like an 8-foot wide breach in the wall between the two buildings. Looked like someone had taken a sledgehammer and knocked the cinder blocks out. My attention was then on the pallets of contraband when we heard voices and footsteps, and 2 men stepped through the breach in the wall. Big men of that no-neck subspecies with powerful arms, long divorced of any ability to touch their sides. Both were wearing short-sleeve shirts hanging outside their pants. One wore a bowling shirt, the other a gaudy Hawaiian number. The bowler was also holding on to a length of iron pipe. The bowler stepped closer and demanded to know what the hell were we doing in the basement, and he suggested we might want to leave now. The 80-plus-year-old Mr. Miller drew himself up to his not inconsiderable height and stepped right into the bowler's face, as I wondered, what had I gotten myself into? Suddenly, perhaps the most authoritarian voice I'd ever heard ordered the 2 mobsters to stop trespassing on his property, leave the photographer alone. Did they not know that this brave, young, fine photographer was a noted photojournalist for the New York Daily News, which was in those days the newspaper of record for the mafia? And I was not a photographer for them. And I was as startled as those 2 mafia soldiers to realize that the voice belonged to this 80-plus-year-old. And Mr. Miller wasn't through. He kept after those men, telling them they would regret ever as much looking into his basement. They'd better have their booty out of his space by the next day. And he expected that the damaged wall would, of course, be repaired immediately. And all the while, he is backing them up right into their own basement. The last look I had of them, they looked exactly like my kid brother did when our mom was going after him. A week or so later, I brought the pictures up to Mr. Miller's art-filled apartment. He told me the stolen loot was gone, the wall being repaired. And shortly thereafter, my life, my geography changed. And I never again had the pleasure of his company. Mr. Hugh Gordon Miller, author, former Assistant U.S. Attorney General, art collector, diplomat, friend of writers, presidents, international statesmen, young photographers, and Mr. Samuel Langhorne Clemens's personal secretary and assistant. Mr. Miller died, as far as I know, in 1962 at the age of either 86 or 92. I don't know. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So this was about you in New York City, in Chelsea, which I know means around 23rd Street on the west side.
Right. My camera store was on 26th Street.
Uh-huh. And how old were you?
I was probably 18.
Uh-huh.
Living on my own in the city
Mm-hmm.
on $44 a week, which wasn't a lot of money back then.
So this was an adventure you never forgot.
it was an adventure I never, and a man I never forgot. He just made this incredible impression on me. And he connected me. I felt I was connected, directly connected to the world of Mark Twain, directly connected to a man who had been in the Civil, been around during the Civil War, who himself knew people had been around in the Revolutionary War.
Hmm.
And I just felt, and he had a sense of connection, and I felt that sense of it gave a very unconnected, rudderless young man a sense of being connected to something bigger than myself. And that was probably one of the first times in my life that ever happened. Uh, I never became a great photographer, unfortunately. I did make my living trying to do it for a while, but I was destined to work with words rather than images, I think. Yeah. And I don't know now whether young people have the opportunities to connect and to have that kind of life. For one, I can't imagine working in a retail store and still being able to live in Manhattan these
Mm.
days. The stores, they're not hiring people. There's no jobs. Celebrities, anybody of wealth, celebrity is protected from the rest of us.
But no, but the thing is that even when I was young in New York City, which was in the 70s, 50 years ago,
Yeah.
you could have a job like that and support yourself.
And you could. I think it's a 21st century phenomenon.
Yeah. Now, forget about it. Now
Yeah.
you can only do that if if you have money from your parents or something.
Yeah. And for me, working in that, I worked in Manhattan, I don't know, till I got drafted into the Army. So 3 or 4 years. And it's given me a lifetime of stories. I tell a lot of stories about those days, and I feel like I haven't begun to scratch the surface.
Hmm. Well, you obviously have a deep love for cultural history.
I do. I do. It means a lot to me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else have any
Yeah,
questions?
anyone else want to add anything or ask a question or make a comment or resonate in any way? Alistair.
The man
Hi,
I was looking at. Am I?
Les, thank you so much for that
Thank
story.
you.
It was wonderful. I just brings me back to New York City, and I just loved it. I wanted to ask you, what does it mean to you to tell that story, which happened so many years ago in your life, today? Does it mean anything different to you when you tell it now?
That is a good question. Um, when I decided I wanted to tell that story here, so I started, as I always do, I started redoing the story, re-looking at it and getting it back in my head and all. And it awoke in me all the feelings I had being this unmoored young man, feeling back then like I was such a failure. I was totally unprepared for college, and they did me a favor by kicking me out. I didn't know that then. And I and it helped me to when I tell that story now, and I felt it today, I felt it during the prep. It put those old demons, it puts that old story in a new light, and helps me to see this is what I was meant, this is where I was meant to be, this is what I was meant to do. I believe we all have. I'm only here, I think, because I've had hundreds of angels in my life, and they don't come with wings and halos. They come wearing old gray overcoats on a hot summer day, offering you a chance to make a couple of dollars or reaching out a hand or something. They're just our angels. And I hope that I've learned to be an angel to somebody else. Not very well, I think, but I do try sometimes.
So
And
in
it
in
connects me. Yes.
in what field, in what profession have you worked?
I started out in photography, moved over into graphic arts and advertising, became an advertising executive for a big corporation for a few years, a number of years. Then owned my own business and I was in the pottery, ceramics and ceramic supply business for a decade. Then finally went back to school in my 40s, became a therapist and worked in domestic violence and with adolescents and kids and their families for 20 or 25 years. And then on 9/11, 2001, I was at a darn meeting of the agency I worked for, and I watched the planes crash into the towers in my New York. Where the towers are, when I was a little kid, another story, I used to go by myself downtown to that area where my eye doctor was to have my eyes checked. 9 or 10 years old, I was able to go downtown in Manhattan. We were free range kids.
Yeah.
And that was gone. And I knew the world wasn't going to be the same. My world wasn't going to be the same. By March, I had quit my job and I've been living on air ever since, teaching, doing a lot of teaching about story and storytelling and as much telling as I could do. Trying to learn how to be a human being.
Wow.
And I think storytelling is probably one of the major things that makes us human beings. Storytelling and story listening. I really believe that.
Thank you, Les. I think you are an angel.
Thank you, Alistair. I cut you off. I'm sorry.
He said you're an angel.
Pardon?
He said you are an angel too.
I hope so. I hope so. And thank you, Janet and Kathy Mintz from Richmond and fellow friends on the storytelling road for watching this morning. I see you down there. Thanks.
We'll vouch for it. You're an angel.
Barry, did you want to say something?
I did. I just want to say, Les, I really appreciated some of your turns of phrase. You know, the subspecies without the necks and the arms that have been long divorced from the torsos. Just you know, creating images with very few words, which is what we all strive to do.
Yeah, well, we're word painters. Thank you. And I knew those guys. I grew up. My best friend, when I was a younger teenager, my best friend was the son of a mafia guy in New York. And I spent many a Sunday afternoon around a dinner table with those guys.
Okay, thank you very much, Les.
Thank you.
Oh, Gustavo, did you want to say something?
Oh, my mother was born. No, she was born in Peru, but she went to New York in 1918 or 1920, and she lived through the Roaring Twenties there. So it's a very important thing for me because she died relatively young, and I've tried to reconstruct her life and our life as family, and many things that you told have been important, because when I was like a month in New York, and I went to the school that she went, and I started to travel, and then I've done some things here also with my grandmother. So that kind of things that links up to the past and to our past are very important for us and for other people also, because I work with a environment of older people that we tell stories. We are tercera edad people that we tell stories in schools and in libraries, and many people don't see how their past. These people don't see how their past is important
Yeah.
to share, and I thank you for that.
Yeah, yeah. I've done that same reconstruction. I mean, all we have to go on are bits of fragments. And out of those fragments, we have to build the lives of the ones who came before us. And I think that way they become alive in us.
And it was fun living in the 1920s. At least my grandmother told me more, because my mother was not very talkative. She didn't talk very much. My grandmother did, and there were many things that she did there when she was in New York. When my other aunt were there.
Maybe she met my father and mother in those days in New York. Who knows?
Okay, thank you very much. We're going to stop this recording now.